My mother-in-law took my car keys, threw my clothes onto the driveway and told me I had no place left to go. What she didn't know was that my father was already driving toward the house with information that would destroy everything she thought she owned. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. For 3 years I tried to make peace with my mother-in-law, Darlene Brooks. No matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. She acted as if the house belonged only to her. Every room, every decision, every family gathering had to happen on her terms. She reminded everyone constantly that it was her home and that we were lucky to be there. I kept telling myself things would improve. I loved my husband, Evan, and I believed that eventually he would set boundaries with his mother. Instead, he spent years avoiding conflict. Whenever Darlene criticized me, he stayed quiet. Whenever she crossed a line, he found an excuse for her behavior. The final argument started over something small. Looking back, the reason hardly mattered. Darlene was already angry before I spoke a single word. Within minutes, her voice filled the house. She accused me of being ungrateful and disrespectful. I tried to walk away, hoping things would cool down. Instead, she marched to the hallway table, grabbed my car keys and told me I was leaving. At first I thought she was bluffing. Then she began carrying my belongings outside. My suitcase landed on the driveway. A box of personal items followed. Then another. I stood frozen in shock as years of my life were tossed outside like garbage. Darlene, stop, I pleaded. She pointed toward the street. Get out. You don't live here anymore. I looked at Evan, waiting for him to say something. Anything. He didn't. He stood beside his mother with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the ground. That silence hurt more than every insult she had ever thrown at me. Tears filled my eyes as I stared at the man who promised to stand beside me. In the moment I needed him most, he chose her. I was standing next to my scattered belongings when a black SUV pulled into the driveway. The vehicle stopped. The driver's door opened. My father, Wade Hale, stepped out and took in the scene without saying a word. His eyes moved from my luggage to my face and then to Darlene and Evan. Finally, he looked at me and spoke calmly. Get in, he said. We're done here. I picked up my bags and followed him, having no idea that this day was about to change everything. The drive back to my childhood home felt longer than it really was. Neither my father nor I spoke much. I sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, trying to process everything that had happened. My clothes had been thrown onto a driveway. My husband had stood there and watched. My marriage suddenly felt like something I no longer recognized. When we arrived, my father carried my bags inside without asking questions. The house looked exactly as I remembered. For the first time that day I felt safe. I sat at the kitchen table while he made coffee. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It gave me room to think. Eventually he sat across from me and asked a simple question. How long has this been going on? The answer came out before I could stop it. Years. Once I started talking, I couldn't stop. I told him how Darlene controlled nearly every part of our lives. She demanded to know where money was being spent and often inserted herself into financial decisions that should have belonged to Evan and me. Family dinners happened only when she approved them. Holiday plans revolved around her wishes. Even small decisions somehow became her business. Then I admitted something I had never told anyone. Darlene insisted on having access to my spare car keys. My father's expression hardened, but he remained quiet. I continued explaining how I spent years trying to avoid arguments. Every time Darlene crossed a line, I convinced myself it wasn't worth fighting over. Every time Evan stayed silent, I told myself things would improve. They never did. That evening my phone buzzed. For a brief moment I hoped Evan was calling to apologize. Instead there was only a short message. He blamed me for what happened. According to him, I had pushed Darlene too far and created unnecessary drama. I stared at the screen for several seconds. No apology. No concern. No request for me to come back. Just blame. The message hurt more than being thrown out. Darlene had never promised to protect me. Evan had. I set my phone down and fought back tears. My father noticed but didn't ask to read the message. Later, as I unpacked my belongings in my old bedroom, he stood in the doorway. There is something that's been bothering me for a while, he said. I looked up. He explained that he had noticed strange things about Darlene years earlier. Certain comments never sat right with him. Recently, she had been bragging again about owning the family house and having complete authority over it. He shook his head slowly. The more I think about it, the less sense it makes. I asked what he meant. My father folded his arms. I think it's time I take a closer look at that house and find out what she's not telling everyone. Over the next few days, I slowly settled into life at my father's house. The shock of being thrown out began to fade, but the pain remained. Every morning I woke up hoping things would feel different. Instead, I found myself replaying the moment Evan stood beside his mother and said nothing. While I focused on putting myself back together, my father focused on something else. He started asking questions. The more he thought about Darlene's behavior, the more suspicious he became. She had spent years telling everyone that the house belonged entirely to her. Whenever disagreements happened, she reminded people that she could remove anyone she wanted. She acted as though her authority was absolute. But my father kept coming back to one simple question. If Darlene truly owned everything, why did so many details seem unclear? He began speaking with people who had known the Brooks family for years. Several longtime neighbors remembered Darlene's late husband, Grant Brooks, handling nearly all property matters before his death. One neighbor laughed when my father mentioned Darlene managing paperwork. That wasn't her thing, the woman said. Grant took care of all that. Another neighbor said something similar. According to them, Grant was always the person discussing legal matters, taxes, and property issues. When my father shared this information with me, it triggered an old memory. Years earlier, I had walked into the dining room and found Darlene looking through a stack of documents. The moment she noticed me, she gathered everything and shoved the papers into a drawer. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I wasn't so sure. As we talked, more memories surfaced. There had been several occasions when Darlene became defensive whenever conversations involved the house. She never explained details. She simply expected everyone to accept her version of the story. My father decided it was time to stop guessing. He contacted an attorney friend and explained the situation. Soon they were reviewing public records and searching for anything connected to the property. The process moved slowly, but my father remained determined. Meanwhile, Evan continued making everything worse. Instead of reaching out with concern, he kept defending his mother. Every message carried the same theme. Darlene had done nothing wrong. I was overreacting. I should apologize and move on. Reading those messages became exhausting. Each one pushed me further away from him. The man I married seemed more interested in protecting his mother's image than saving our relationship. As my father searched for answers, I began realizing something painful. Even if the truth exposed Darlene's lies, it might not be enough to fix what Evan had broken. About a week after my father began digging into the property's history, his attorney friend called with the first real breakthrough. The news immediately caught our attention. Darlene's name did appear on several documents connected to the house, which explained why she always acted so confident. On the surface, it looked like she had authority over the property. But the deeper the attorney looked, the stranger things became. There were older filings that pointed to a different arrangement. Certain records referenced documents connected to the property that did not fit the story Darlene had been telling for years. More importantly, several references mentioned a trust. The trust was not clearly explained in the public records, but its existence raised serious questions. If Darlene truly owned the house outright, why was a trust involved at all? My father sat quietly as the attorney walked through the findings. When the call ended, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. I think she's been hiding something for a long time, he said. I couldn't disagree. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but we still didn't know exactly what it meant. What we did know was that Darlene's version of events was no longer the only version. For years, she had spoken as if her ownership was unquestionable. Now there was evidence suggesting the situation was far more complicated. Part of me felt hopeful. Another part felt exhausted. I wanted the truth to come out. I wanted answers. I wanted accountability for what she had done. At the same time, I found myself thinking less about Darlene and more about Evan. The distance between us kept growing. Every day that passed made it harder to imagine repairing the damage. The eviction had hurt, but his silence during it hurt even more. Since then, he had made no effort to understand my side. Every conversation somehow became another defense of his mother. Then came a development I never expected. One afternoon, I received legal paperwork. At first, I thought it was connected to the property investigation. It wasn't. Evan had filed for separation. I stared at the documents in disbelief. There had been no serious discussion beforehand. No attempt to work through our problems. No meeting. No warning. Just paperwork. When I finally spoke to him, his explanation was simple. He believed separating was the best option. He also seemed remarkably confident about his future. The confidence made sense once I thought about it. Evan still believed everything Darlene had promised him. He trusted that his mother controlled the property, the finances, and eventually the inheritance. He was convinced she would protect him. As I put the papers down, I realized something important. The fight for the truth was moving forward. My marriage, however, might already be over. A few days after Evan filed for separation, my father received another call from his attorney friend. This time the tone of the conversation was very different. They had found something important. The attorney had managed to obtain additional records connected to Grant Brooks, Darlene's late husband. Many of the documents were old and some took time to track down, but together they revealed a much clearer picture of what had happened before Grant's death. That afternoon, my father and I sat across from the attorney as he spread several copies across the table. At first, most of it looked like ordinary legal paperwork. Then he pointed to a document that changed everything. A family trust. The trust had been established shortly before Grant died. For a moment, nobody spoke. The attorney explained that the trust appeared to play a major role in the ownership and management of the property. It wasn't just a minor detail buried in old records. It was a central part of how the house was supposed to be handled. My father exchanged a look with me. We both immediately understood why the references to a trust kept appearing in earlier filings. The attorney continued reviewing the documents. What shocked us was not simply the existence of the trust. It was the restrictions inside it. Several conditions governed how the property could be managed. Certain powers were limited. Specific responsibilities had been assigned. The arrangement was far more structured than Darlene had ever admitted. In fact, some sections suggested she did not have complete authority over the house at all. For years she had presented herself as the unquestioned owner. She had threatened people with removal. She had controlled decisions. She had acted as though nobody could challenge her. Now the paperwork was telling a very different story. The attorney was careful not to jump to conclusions before reviewing everything, but one fact was becoming impossible to ignore. Darlene had never shared the full truth with the family. As the meeting ended, I sat quietly thinking about everything that had happened. For weeks, I had viewed the eviction as the center of the conflict. Now it seemed much larger than that. This wasn't simply a fight between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. It wasn't even just about my marriage. There were years of hidden information behind Darlene's behavior. Suddenly, I understood why my father had remained so calm on the driveway. While I had been focused on the humiliation of being thrown out, he had recognized something else. He suspected Darlene's confidence came from a story she had been telling everyone for years. And now that story was beginning to fall apart. The closer we got to the truth, the clearer it became that the house itself held the answers. The full review of the trust took time, but when the final findings arrived, they changed everything. My father and I met with the attorney again. A thick folder sat on the table between us. Weeks of research had finally produced clear answers. The attorney opened the file and began explaining the trust in detail. Grant Brooks had created it shortly before his death. The purpose was outlined plainly in the documents. He wanted the property to remain a place of security for the family. He did not want the house used as leverage, punishment, or a tool to control relatives. As I listened, I felt my stomach tighten. That was exactly how Darlene had used it for years. The attorney continued. According to the trust, Darlene had been given the right to live in the home and manage certain expenses connected to the property. She could oversee maintenance and handle routine responsibilities. But she was never granted permanent ownership. She did not possess the unrestricted authority she had claimed for years. The house was not truly hers to do with as she pleased. For a long moment, nobody spoke. I thought about every threat Darlene had made. Every time she reminded people that it was her house. Every occasion she used that claim to force others into silence. The foundation of her power had been built on something that was never completely true. Then the attorney reached the most important section. The trust contained conditions designed to protect family members from exactly the kind of behavior Grant feared. One condition stood out immediately. Residents could not be removed from the property in a way that violated the trust's purpose. The attorney looked directly at us. The eviction raises serious concerns. I stared at him. What does that mean? It means her actions may have violated multiple trust provisions. The room suddenly felt very quiet. For years, Darlene had treated the house like a weapon. She believed it gave her complete control. Now that same house was becoming her biggest problem. The attorney explained that trust administrators would need to review what happened. If violations were confirmed, consequences could follow. The more he spoke, the clearer the situation became. Darlene had not simply thrown me out after an argument. She may have triggered legal issues connected to the very property she relied on for authority. As we left the meeting, I thought back to the afternoon on the driveway. At the time, it felt like the worst day of my life. Now I saw it differently. Darlene believed she was demonstrating power. Instead, she may have exposed years of deception in a single moment. The eviction she expected everyone to accept quietly had become the event that forced the truth into the open. And the consequences were only beginning. A few weeks after the trust review was completed, the attorneys arranged a formal meeting. Everyone who needed to hear the findings would be present. I arrived with my father and our attorney. The atmosphere felt serious from the moment we entered the conference room. A few minutes later, Darlene and Evan walked in. Neither of them appeared worried. Darlene carried herself with the same confidence she always had. She barely looked at me before taking her seat. Evan followed her and sat quietly beside her. From the beginning, Darlene acted as though the meeting was a waste of time. When the discussion started, she immediately repeated the same argument she had used for years. The house belonged to her. She could decide who stayed there. She could decide who left. Nobody had the right to question her authority. Listening to her, I almost felt like nothing had changed. But then the documents were placed on the table. The attorney opened the trust file and began reviewing its contents. At first, Darlene remained calm. Then specific sections were read aloud. I noticed the change immediately. The confidence in her face began to fade. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain. The attorney carefully explained Grant Brooks's intentions when he created the trust. He outlined the restrictions attached to the property and described the limits placed on Darlene's authority. Every explanation weakened the story she had been telling for years. The room grew quieter with each page. Then came the most important point. The attorney explained that Darlene had never been granted full ownership of the house. She had rights and responsibilities under the trust, but permanent ownership was never transferred to her. Darlene interrupted several times. She insisted the interpretation was wrong. She claimed everyone understood the property belonged to her. But the documents said otherwise. Facts replaced assumptions. Written records replaced years of claims. Across the table, Evan looked confused. The more information he heard, the more uncomfortable he became. Eventually, he stopped defending his mother and simply listened. For years he had believed everything she told him. Now he was discovering that many of those statements were either incomplete or completely false. The attorneys then addressed the eviction. They explained how removing me from the property raised concerns under multiple trust provisions. Grant had specifically created protections to prevent family members from using the house as a tool of control. According to the findings, Darlene's actions appeared to conflict directly with those protections. The tension in the room became impossible to ignore. Nobody argued anymore. Nobody interrupted. As the legal experts continued their explanation, the truth finally stood in the open. The story Darlene had built her authority on for years was collapsing in front of everyone, including the son who had trusted her most. The trust administrators moved far more quickly than Darlene expected. Within days of the formal findings, new restrictions were put in place regarding the property. Decisions that Darlene had made alone for years now required oversight. Her ability to act without accountability disappeared almost immediately. He fought every step. She argued with administrators, questioned the review process, and insisted she was being treated unfairly. None of it changed the outcome. The trust documents were clear and the administrators followed them. As their investigation expanded, financial records connected to the property were examined in greater detail. Payments, transfers, and management decisions that had never been questioned before suddenly received close attention. Several actions raised concerns. The administrators requested explanations and supporting documents. What had once been private became subject to review. For years, Darlene operated as though nobody could challenge her decisions. Now she found herself answering difficult questions. The situation hit Evan just as hard. Throughout his adult life, he believed his mother controlled assets that would eventually pass to him. She often spoke about the future as though everything was already decided. Those promises had shaped many of his choices. The review revealed a different reality. Large portions of what he expected were tied to trust conditions and administrative decisions beyond Darlene's control. Much of the financial security she described was never guaranteed in the way she claimed. When he finally understood that, he looked genuinely shocked. For the first time, he realized how much of his future had been built on assumptions. As the truth spread through the family, old fears began disappearing. Relatives who had spent years avoiding conflict started speaking openly. Some admitted they stayed quiet because they believed Darlene had the power to remove people from the property whenever she wanted. Others shared stories of threats, pressure, and manipulation that sounded painfully familiar. The more people learned, the less influence Darlene seemed to have. Conversations that once stopped when she entered a room continued without hesitation. People who once sought her approval no longer appeared concerned about her opinion. The change happened so quickly that it almost felt unreal. A woman who spent years controlling everyone around her was suddenly unable to control the narrative. Through all of it, I mostly watched from a distance. I didn't celebrate. I didn't seek revenge. I simply observed the consequences unfold. The people who humiliated me on that driveway were now facing problems created by their own decisions. No secret plan had caused their downfall. No one had set a trap for them. The truth had done all the work. As Darlene's authority continued fading, I found myself feeling lighter with each passing day. The life she tried to control was finally my own again, and nothing happening around that house could take that away. Evan came to see me on his own one evening. My father was at work, so the house was quiet. I noticed his car outside before he knocked. For a moment I just stood there, not sure if I wanted to open the door. When I finally did, he looked different. Less confident. More tired. He asked if we could talk. We sat in the living room, a space that now felt like mine again. At first, neither of us spoke much. Then he started apologizing. He said he should have defended me on the driveway. He said he froze. He said he didn't know what to do in that moment. His voice sounded regretful but also unsure, like he was still trying to understand what had gone wrong. I listened without interrupting. I had heard apologies before, but this one felt different because it came after everything had already fallen apart. After he finished speaking, I told him how it felt from my side. I reminded him how many times I had been put in situations where I stood alone. Not just on that driveway but long before it. Small moments that built up over time. Times when I needed him to stand with me and he chose silence instead. He tried to explain that he never wanted conflict with his mother. That was the problem. For years he chose comfort over loyalty. He avoided difficult conversations. He let Darlene set the rules of our life. He allowed her voice to become louder than ours. Even now, after everything that had been exposed, I could still see it clearly. The legal findings had revealed Darlene's control, but they hadn't changed the deeper issue in our marriage. Evan still struggled to separate himself from her influence. I realized something important in that moment. The problem was never just his mother. It was his willingness to let her lead his decisions. The silence on the driveway was not a single mistake. It was part of a pattern. We sat there for a long time after that, not arguing, just facing the truth of it. Eventually he asked if there was any way to fix things. I didn't answer right away. I thought about everything that had happened. The eviction. The silence. The separation papers. The way he kept choosing his mother's version of reality over mine. And I understood something clearly. Even if Darlene's lies were collapsing, my marriage had already been damaged beyond repair. I told him I couldn't go back. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I was angry. But because I finally saw what my life looked like when I stopped being second to someone else's control. That was the moment I chose myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't asking for permission to leave. I was already moving forward. Months passed and life slowly started to feel different for me. I moved into a small place of my own. It wasn't large, but it was peaceful. There were no constant arguments, no tension in the air, no feeling of walking on eggshells. For the first time in years, I could breathe without worrying about someone else's mood controlling my day. I also started a new job opportunity that gave me space to rebuild my confidence. Work felt steady and simple, but it gave me something I had lost for a long time. A sense of direction that belonged only to me. My relationship with my father became stronger than ever. Wade never pushed me to move on faster than I was ready. He just stayed present. He showed up when needed, listened when I spoke, and never made me feel weak for what I had been through. That quiet support meant more than anything else. Over time, I realized how much I had depended on him in those early days after the driveway incident. But instead of controlling my choices, he had simply given me space to make my own. Things with Darlene were no longer part of my daily life. Her influence over the family had collapsed after the trust findings. The control she once held so tightly was gone, replaced by legal restrictions and distance from the people she used to dominate. Even Evan's life had changed in ways he never expected. The decisions he made that day followed him. The silence, the separation, and the blind loyalty all came with consequences he could no longer avoid. We didn't speak anymore. One evening, I drove through the old neighborhood without planning to. I slowed down near the street where everything had fallen apart. The house was still there, but it felt far away from who I was now. I remembered standing on that driveway, watching my belongings scattered outside, feeling like everything in my life was ending. I could still hear my father's voice from that day. "Get in. We're done here." Back then, I thought he was taking me away from everything I knew. But I understand it differently now. He wasn't ending my life. He was stopping me from staying in one that was breaking me slowly. As I drove away that night, I didn't feel pain anymore. I felt clarity. What once looked like loss had turned into something else entirely. A beginning I didn't recognize at first, but now fully understood. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Your support means a lot. See you in the next one.